So as we begin our new series, we've decided for these summer months that we would look on the practical side. You hear this word or this term or this phrase, spiritual formation, and it gets thrown around loosely, and we have to decide what it means for us, what it means for myself. How do I personally begin to form myself to look and to resemble Jesus? And so we're going to move as a congregation through this series as we aim to become more like Jesus. And so the first part, this month of June, we're going to be looking at reimagination. What does it mean to see, to imagine, and to think like Christ? Now, we're still keeping in line with our overall theme. Whereas we're looking still in Luke, the 2nd chapter in the 52nd verse, where it says, "And Jesus grew in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and man." We'll just be highlighting more on the stature side. But I think it's interesting that these words show up in our text, in our Bibles, that Jesus grew. That means he matured, he developed. At one time, there was something that he did not have that over time he gained. And this is Jesus we're talking about. This is God in the flesh who's growing. So therefore, if Jesus himself was on a spiritual formation journey, if he's growing, therefore we have no excuse. We also must be growing. We must begin to understand what it means and what it looks like to grow. So to start off this reimagination series, I want us to look at a particular passage beginning in Matthew, the 5th chapter. Because I think this helps set the landscape for what it means to reimagine as God would have us to. Part of the Sermon on the Mount, you get these consistent sayings in chapter 5 where Jesus is reinterpreting the law of Moses. And the phrase that you see on the slide is the phrase you get so often. In verse 21, it says, "You have heard that it was said to people long ago, 'You shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment.' But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment." These are Jesus' words concerning murder. He says about adultery in verse 27, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery.' But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart." Concerning divorce, he says, "It has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality, makes her the victim of adultery. And anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery." When it talks about oaths, he says, "Again, you have heard that it was said to people long ago, 'Do not break your oath, but fulfill to the Lord the vows you have made.' But I tell you, do not swear an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And while you do not swear by your head, for you cannot make even one white hair or black. All you need to say is simply yes or no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one." He says, "You have heard that it is said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And concerning your enemies, you have heard that it was said, 'Love your neighbor and hate your enemy.' But I tell you, love your enemies. And pray for those who persecute you, that you may be the children of your Father in heaven." See, for so long I've read over these passages and I've studied through this set of phrases, this Sermon on the Mount, and it still strikes me that the law given to Moses by God is now being reinterpreted by God in the flesh. Did God make a mistake when he first gave them out? Was there something wrong with the phrasing or the wording that it needed to be updated or changed by Jesus? See, there's this point where we have to begin to see God as a God of transition. God is active and moving. Therefore, our understanding of God must be growing, active, and moving. So Jesus comes along and he reinterprets the same law given to Moses by God, and he says we need to update this for the current culture, time, and people present. It's not that anything was wrong with what was said in the beginning, but it just might have missed the point for what's going on today. And so I want to reframe it, recapsulize it so that you understand what the original meaning was. Because now there's a distance and a disconnect between the original writing, the original words, and the culture. So we have to connect the dots. And so Jesus goes about connecting the dots. But as great as connecting the dots are for Jesus, it causes a lot of problems for those who are not ready for those dots to be connected. See, Jesus is dealing with people who have a frame of reference of God that's like this. See, I have an idea of what God is and what God isn't. And as long as your idea of what God is fits my idea of who God is, then we're okay. We're completely fine. But if for one chance you step outside of what I believe God is, then we have a big issue. And Jesus is saying, well, then it's not necessarily me who has the issue, it's you. And you need to learn how to expand your view of God. You now have to be in a position to be open-minded enough to say that I don't know all there is to know about God, nor will I ever, but I'm in a position to learn. I'm in a position to engage other people to hopefully allow my view of God, my vision of God, my imagination of who God is and what God is about to grow and to expand and get bigger. But I don't want to give you this lightly because this isn't an easy process. When you begin to stretch what God is doing and stretch your view to wrap your mind around who God is, you're left with more questions than answers. There's more ambiguity than most of us would like, and the mystery of God never goes away. It's a never-ending tunnel of light. But you can refuse the process. You can say that I'm comfortable where I am, I want to stay where I am, and I like the God that I've created. And what you'll be inevitably saying is that I'm okay with idolatry. Because there is no God of your own creation. That God doesn't really exist. If you could control God, then he wouldn't be God. It's amazing what happens when Moses encounters God and Moses asks him, well, who shall I say sent me? And God's reply is, I am. Moses is struck by that very utterance because Moses realizes there's nothing about that helps clarify what I'm about to tell these people. I am doesn't help me describe you. I am doesn't help me wrap my mind around who you are. To go up to someone and say I am doesn't give you any clarification or a greater description. It just leaves you just as bewildered as you began. And God said that's the entire point. You're never going to fully grasp who I am. And you have to learn to be okay with that. But that doesn't mean we stop searching. It doesn't mean we stop journeying. Nor does it mean that we get to a point where we become content and we fixate a God that we can't control. So looking at that, I want us to look at this next slide. This great psychology illusion. How many of you see a young woman in this picture? How many of you see an older lady in this picture? How many of you can remarkably see both? The psychologists say that it takes up to over 20 times of seeing this picture before you can identify both instantaneously. Most people only see one or the other, and until you begin to see it repetitively over 20 times, you'll begin to see both simultaneously. I can still tell that some of you are still trying to figure out the opposite one. That's fine. Sooner or later, you can just Google it and you'll get it. But see, our understanding of God is a lot like this picture. We see what we've been trained, taught, and formed to see. We see God as we've been taught about God. What we then have to do is to look through the eyes of others in order to see the other. We have to have someone show it to us, describe it to us, for us to see the rest of the picture. See, at a time you have to become vulnerable enough to say that I don't get it completely. There's more than I see on my own. So in John chapter 9, we walk through this story of the man who's born blind. And the story picks up and it says, as he went along, this is Jesus, he saw a man blind from birth. His disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? I want us to stop right there. This very question helps us to see how the disciples see this man. The fact that this man is blind and that's all they see, their first question is, who sinned? Their imagination of God says that if somebody was born blind, then somebody sinned to make this happen. This is their understanding of God. This is their view. Jesus comes along and helps them to reimagine this by saying, neither this man nor his parents sinned, said Jesus. But this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. So Jesus goes along, he spits on the ground, he places the mud that mixed with his saliva on the man's eyes, and he tells the man to go wash, and the man comes back and he's seeing. And as soon as the man gets his sight, we run into verse 8, and all the people who are used to seeing this man blind show up. And this conversation starts. It says, his neighbors and those who had formerly seen him begging asked, isn't this the same man who used to sit and beg? Some claimed that he was. Others said, no, he only looks like him. But he himself insisted, I am the man. How then were your eyes open, they asked. He replied, the man they called Jesus made some mud. He put it on my eyes and told me to go to Siloam and wash. So I went and washed, and then I could see. In their mind, this doesn't happen. This isn't possible. This isn't something they can grasp because of their idea of who God is and who God works through. Just like the disciples, they view this man as a sinner, and God doesn't act this way. Not my God. He doesn't do these things. Jesus is trying to help them reimagine. So the people then in verse 13 says they brought him to the Pharisees, the man who had been blind. Now the day on which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes was a Sabbath. Some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, speaking about Jesus, for he does not keep the Sabbath. But others asked, how can a sinner perform such signs? So they were divided. They still did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they sent for the man's parents. Is this your son, they asked? Is this the one who you say was born blind? How is it now he can see? So they take this man to the Pharisees to try to explain this, and the Pharisee was like, he wasn't blind. There's no way. And not to mention, the guy who healed him did it on the Sabbath, so he can't be of God. Because in their mind, you don't work on the Sabbath. So supposedly, healing someone on the Sabbath is work. For them, this is punishable. So they go and get the man's parents, and the parents say, this is our son. This is him. You have a mother who's saying, I know my child. But they don't care. They're not so concerned with the issue as they are concerned with the petty things in their view of God. See, they're in a paradox where they're in a position where they have to expand their view of God, and they're refusing the expansion. Because if they expand their view of God, they don't know where it will lead them. So they stand on the fringes and begin to discuss among one another, and they get into a discourse and they walk out divided. Have we ever been there? You ever been in a conversation with someone and all they wanted to do was point out right, but truly they were wrong? And the reason why they were wrong is because as you were talking to them about a different view of God, they couldn't even see the difference. All they could give you was the rhetoric of doctrine and what they've been indoctrinated with, and you were trying to show them Jesus and they couldn't see it. This is the text. This man is trying to get them to see Jesus, and all they can see is their doctrine and how they've conformed God to it. And in order to get a different grasp of God, they had to let go of something. They have to place their faith in the God who's actually living instead of the rules which they've been given. And they're not ready or willing to do it. So we get to verse 24. And it says, a second time they summoned the man who had been blind. Give glory to God by telling the truth, they said. We know this man is a sinner. The man who was once blind replied, whether he is a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see. Then they asked him, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? He answered, I have told you already, and you did not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples too? Then they hurled insults at him and said, you are this fellow's disciple. We are disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses, but as for this fellow, we don't even know where he comes from. The man answered, now that is remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners. He listens to the godly person who does his will. Nobody has ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. To this they replied, you were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us? And they threw him out. Sounds like some of our conversations, some of our discourse, some of our arguments. See, when you begin to talk about God and you begin to reframe God for people, people become defensive really quickly. Especially when their view of God is limited to a set of rules and a set of doctrines only. When you begin to ask them to reimagine God or to experience God in new ways, if they've never experienced God before, it's a new task and a new discernment. And it's difficult. It's hard for us to begin to open ourselves up to something we've never experienced before. And Jesus is saying that if you want this new thing called the kingdom of God, you have to be willing to do it. If you're going to be a part of what God calls his new kingdom, his new revelation, you then have to open yourself up to what God is doing and to the reinterpretation of the text. You have to reinterpret your life and reorient yourself around what God is doing in the here and now. That means you have to begin to see God as God really is. And God is not a set of rules that allow us to control him. God is not a set of doctrines or a set of regulations. God is bigger and always has been and always will be. But if that's all we reduce God to, then we reduce God to idolatry, and we try to push everybody else through the same idolatrous door that we're in. Because we're comfortable there and we enjoy being there because it makes us and it makes our life easy. But just as you see in this text, as soon as someone steps out with a new view of God, they either have to conform or we push them away. Instead of taking an internal examination and say, maybe there's something I can learn. Maybe they have another part of the picture or another piece of the puzzle that I can begin to see God in a much larger way. See, I would hate for us to have to go through life only to realize that we missed the opportunity to see God in a much bigger way. I was telling a story in our sermon club meeting about an accident I encountered a while back, of a gentleman who had been run off the road on a motorcycle. And the guy who had run him off the road in a car had stopped a little bit ahead of him, and he had come back, and we were talking, and The first thing out of his mouth, he said, I didn't see him. I just didn't see him. But what he really meant is the way that I've looked out of my mirrors, I didn't notice what was behind me. But saying I didn't see him takes the blame away. If he would have admitted the truth, what he meant was when I looked in my mirrors, if I looked in my mirrors, I didn't do a good job or an accurate job of what I should have done to avoid what just happened. But see, we say the same thing. Oh, I just didn't see it. That's because you didn't look for it. And Jesus is trying to help us to find out how to look differently, how to see differently, how to reorient ourselves to view things differently so that we can see what we should have been seeing all along. But our vision is like this. So we miss what's out here. We miss what's going on in the world. We miss what God is doing, where God is active, only because we're so focused on what's so limited. And when what's limited becomes our focus, then that's all we're accustomed to seeing. But when somebody comes along and tries to expand our view, if we're not willing to accept it, we too become defensive. We get into these arguments and these battles about things that really don't matter at the end of the day, just as you've seen this conversation. They're arguing with this man about something that has to do with absolutely nothing. Whether Jesus is a prophet or he's the Messiah or not, that wasn't the issue in this text. Instead of celebrating this man who's gone from blind to seeing, they're arguing about nothingness. All the while, all they had to do was open their mind to the imagination or reimagining God doing something that they've never seen before and praising God for it. But instead, they say, you know what, that's not my God. He can't do those things. And God is saying all the while, I've been doing it, and I can do it, and I'll continue to do it. Whether you choose to see it that way or buy into it or not, I'm still God, and I'm still doing things in this world. I'm working through the least of these, through the people that you don't even see. But if your mind is so viewed that it only can be these certain people, this small selection, then you'll miss out on the big picture. You'll find yourself looking at a limited scope of who God is and what God is doing through people. I appreciate what Jesus does at the end, because Jesus finds this man after he's been kicked out of the community. He's sitting on the side of the road. And Jesus said, for judgment I have come into the world, so that the blind will see, and those who see will become blind. Some Pharisees who were with him heard him say this and asked, what? Are we blind too? Jesus said, if you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin. But now that you claim you can see, your guilt remains. See, learning to see differently requires a process. It requires us to engage with people who see differently than we do, first and foremost. It requires us to read the Bible with fresh eyes, understanding that we all bring a biasness to the text. There's no way of getting away from it. When people tell you that I'm going to give you the unadulterated truth, they're giving you their interpretation. Whether they want to admit it or not, it's the truth. Because you can't get away from it. But what you can begin to do is you can begin to admit that you see things a certain way. And then say that I'm open to seeing things a different way. I'm opening myself up to what the Spirit and what God can do to show me things that I haven't seen before, to read things the way I've never read them before, to experience God in a way I've never experienced Him ever in my life. But that takes maturity, that takes growth. That takes a different type of person. And Jesus is saying that that's how I matured. I placed myself in situations where I began to expand who I was, who I began to grow around the people I was with, and they began to see me differently to the point that I began to interpret text in a different way that caused people to get flustered. See, this is the story. This is the message. Jesus says, I need you to be able to open and expand yourself to see what God is doing in new ways. Because if all you can see is the rigidity every time, you'll begin to limit God. And Jesus said, I'm not about limiting my Father. I'm never going to put restraints on what God can do. I was talking to Don, and I told him how thankful I was to be here because I began to see texts like I've never seen them before in the last 2 years. to read the Bible with fresh eyes and to see things and go over scriptures that I've read hundreds and thousands of times and to see God in new ways is the most exhilarating experience you will ever have. If you haven't done it, trust me, it is the greatest experience in life. To see God in people that you've never seen God in, to be able to associate people with different and new ideas, it's fantastic. And to see God moving. To literally hear the voice of God is life-changing. It's earth and ground shaking. It will break you down and build you up in ways you never thought possible. But if all you have is a set of rules and a set of doctrines, you'll never get anywhere with God. Because that God can't be restricted to that box. My God doesn't live there. But instead, I told myself that I'd open myself up to go up on journeys with God, even to places where I'm uncomfortable. And believe me, there's been a lot of uncomfortable places and a lot of uncomfortable topics, but I'm able to be there because I know God is there. I'm able to reside there and to put my faith in God that He's not going to leave me or forsake me or lead me to a place that I can't be without His presence. And come to find out, I love it. Even in the midst of the struggles, I love it. Even in the midst of the turmoil and the discussions, and even in the times when we have conflict and discourse, it's beautiful. To have a conversation about God that's so much bigger than whether is it okay to have music or not, or what can women, those conversations at the end of the day become petty in the bigger view of God. But for some of us, that's where we want to be, and that's all we're going to stick to. And that's okay for you, but that's not okay for me, and I don't believe God wants us there. I think Jesus calls us to everywhere and not just that limited view. Jesus calls us to have a widescreen view of reality and not the box TV. See, when you look at the box TV, you never realize what you're missing until you see something in widescreen. Once you see the widescreen, you're like, oh, I didn't know that was there all along. Well, see, that's how God is. Until you begin to see Him bigger, you begin to think, that's who God is. But once you've expanded your view, you'll never go back. One of my greatest mentors always told me, once you begin to see what God sees, you can never not see what God sees. But the problem is what God sees is scary. What God sees is people. See, what God is calling us to do is exactly what Jesus called these people to do, is to see people and not see problems. See, it's easy for us to associate the problem with the person, but Jesus said, I associate the person with God. Instead of associating their flaw and their illness and anything else that seems broken about them, I began to see them as God sees them, as a living, breathing person who possesses the Spirit of God. And they're worthy of my time. They're worthy of my energy. They're worthy of my resources. They're worthy of everything God would give them from me. But for many of us, that's the reason why we'd rather have the box view. Because the widescreen causes me to see everyone. It requires me to see people beyond race, beyond their financial status, beyond their educational level, beyond the poverty system. It requires me to look into the eyes of people and see God resting within them. Which then makes a commitment on my part that says that I then have to engage them. I don't no longer get a choice because God that rests in them also resides in me, and we are connected. It's easy for me to talk about other people's sin and not my own. It's easier for me to display the brokenness of everyone else and to critique them. But when it becomes that I have to critique myself, and when I see my critique of them is me critiquing myself, then it becomes real and it becomes personal. Because everyone else's flaws in this room are my flaws. I'm just as responsible. Whether it's the alcoholic, the drug addict, the sex addict, or whoever else, the liar, the cheater, everyone else's problems are my problems because we're one body. And that's how God sees it. And when God expands your view, that's how you will begin to see it. And when you begin to see it that way, you take a personal interest and engagement in the lives of other people because you care about them genuinely, truly. You begin to have conversations with people who don't always agree with you, and it's okay to have those conversations. You welcome those conversations because you know at the end of the day, no one's going anywhere because it's all about God. To have a conversation about God and not about rules and regulations is a different conversation. The outcome is different because you realize God has something at stake. And it's not about my personal feelings or my comfort level. So when Jesus tells them at the beginning of Matthew, before he gives them the reinterpretation, the reimagination of the law, in the 5th chapter, in the 20th verse, that precedes everything we read at the beginning, he says, "For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven." Jesus says, until you expand your view, the kingdom of heaven won't be for you. Until you can see more than the box view, the kingdom of heaven will not be for you. Until you begin to see people as God sees people, until you ask Jesus to remove the spiritual cataracts out of your eye, you will not inherit the kingdom of God. I have to admit that I needed some spiritual eye surgery. I had to get down on my knees and ask for some spiritual eye surgery. Jesus, as the ophthalmologist, had to remove the blindness from my eyes. Had to remove the blindness from my vision, from my imagination, remove the box that I had placed God in to help me to see the way God sees. And through the difficult process, I tell you that I'm much better for it. And you will be as well. Because when God removes the blindness, all you see is light. Even in the darkest places, all you see is light. You see the light in the people who you think have nothing else to offer. The world has already cast them out, but you see the light of God in them. And you see their value, and you see their worth. You begin to see the world anew, the text anew. You begin to see God moving, working, living. But you can choose to stay where you are. You can choose to have a spiritual blindness that leaves you indebted to following a set of rules that, even as they said, nobody could keep. Or you could live in the grace and the mercy of God that says, you know what? I'd rather go ahead and try for God and get my eyes open. Because if not, then we continue to be just like the parable of the two men who were blind, and we fall into the ditch. And in many ways, spiritually, we've been in the ditch for a long time. We get into ruts. We get into those moments where it just seems like it's all work and no joy with God. Those are symptoms of spiritual blindness. And God is saying, I'm able to move you from the ditch back to the road. And you can help lead others to vision. You can help others begin to see once you begin to see. Or you can pretend that you already see with 20/20 vision. And Jesus will come along and let you know that you've been looking with 20/20 blindness for this long. Just like these Pharisees. They didn't realize their own blindness. They thought that they were seeing everything the way that God saw it. They thought they saw people the way God wanted them to see them. They thought they were doing exactly what God would have them to do. But they missed the most important point. All they were seeing were rules. And God and Jesus were trying to get them to reimagine and begin to see his people. Church, I want to challenge us, and I sincerely mean this, that we began to see what God sees. That we see the world through the eyes of God, so that then we can begin to be the hands and feet of God on this earth. I believe that the reason why it's hard for us to share our faith and us to begin to work is because we just don't know how to see yet. Once you see the world as God sees it, you can't help but to engage it, to love it, to reach out for it, to care for it, to hurt for it. But if you see it with blindness, you'll just do nothing more than critique it. And you'll never learn to engage it and work with God in fixing it. I hope that you'll take that challenge seriously. I pray that as a congregation we will take that challenge seriously, and that we'll lead others to Jesus, who will then remove this blindness from their eyes so that they too can begin to see the world through the eyes of God. If you feel that you've been walking around in spiritual blindness, this is your time. This is between you and your God. Our shepherds will be down here waiting to receive you. They will pray for you. They will offer you a hand. They will do whatever they can to help you remove the spiritual cataracts out of your eye. Or maybe at one time you did see, but now you just can't see anymore. We're here to help you with that too, because sooner or later we developed cataracts again in our eyes. But I don't want you to go another minute, another day without feeling that you have an opportunity to correct the problem. Don't worry about who's looking at you, who's going to judge you or talk about you, because it's your relationship that's at stake. It's your relationship with God that matters. And if you want to begin to see Jesus, if you want to go on a spiritual journey with God, you first have to see him. So if you feel so compelled, I ask that you come as our praise team comes and offers our next selection.